Hello, fourth grade, and welcome back to science. We're still working in the module on the pattern of Earth's changing features, and we're going to work on lesson 11, or sorry, lesson 3 this week. Lesson 3 is titled History of Earth's Surface, and this is going to be the last lesson that's in this module. After that, you're going to have your module test. Now, for our first page, as always, we're going to read through the scenario, the information from layers of rock, and you're going to decide which one of the friends you agree with the most and write out your explanation. Why do you agree with them? What reasons do you have? Please make sure you're using your best handwriting when you're completing this section. Once you're done with that, we're going to take a look at a photo of some fossils in the layer of rock, and you're going to write down what questions you have. So please remember to write down at least 3 questions. Use neat handwriting so that your handwriting is readable when we go to grade it. So here's a picture of our rock. Go ahead and take a look at this and write down at least 3 questions you have about the rock layers and fossils that you see here. Feel free to pause the video if you need additional time to do that. Once completed, you're going to read the STEM career connection about the paleontologist. And you're going to take a look, there's not much to read here actually, you're going to take a look at the image that they have over here, read the captions, take a look closely at the sizes and the measurements and what they're showing. And then you're going to answer your 2 questions. What type of organism do you think an ammonite is? Explain your thinking. And what type of environment do you think ammonites lived? So take a look at the picture of the ammonite and decide what kind of creature you think it was and where you think, or what kind of environment that you thought that it lived in. And then give the essential question a try. What can rock formations tell us about Earth's history? Again, give this your best guess. We're going to learn about this as we go through our lesson. Once you've completed those pages, we have an inquiry activity called Making an Impression. What can you tell by looking at footprints? You'll create a model of fossilized footprints showing an interaction between 2 animals. Predict what you can infer about the fossil organisms by observing the footprints. So in your prediction, you're going to write out what kind of things you think you can determine or decide about the organisms or the living things that made those footprints just by taking a look at them. So you're going to have your investigation here. The materials we're going to use are modeling clay, small objects such as a pencil, shell, eraser, coin, or paperclip. You're going to flatten some modeling clay out on your desk or your table. You're going to use a small object and your fingers to make imprints by pressing them into the modeling clay. Model different animals, heavy, light, walking, and running. Then think of a story about the 2 different animals and use the objects and your fingers to make model footprints that show your story. Exchange clay models with another group and try and infer or figure out the story that the other group modeled. Then we're going to answer our communicate information questions. How did you model the footprints that different animals would make? Number 2, explain how you modeled walking and running. How did you model heavy animals and light animals? What do you think scientists can infer from footprints made long ago? How did your prediction compare with your observations of the activity? So take time to answer these questions carefully. Remember to use complete sentences, your neatest handwriting, and make sure that you're checking your spelling and grammar as you go along. Once completed, we're going to start with our vocabulary. So we have our vocabulary words for this lesson are sedimentary rock, sediments, fossil, and index fossil. So let's stop and take a look at those definitions before we move into our questions. So sedimentary rock is a rock that forms when small bits of matter are pressed together in layers. So think about the experiment that we did in the previous lesson where we were showing weathering and erosion by shaking the rocks in, or shaking the sandstone rocks in a jar of water. Sandstone is a type of sedimentary rock where it's a bunch of different things that got squished together and formed into a rock over time because all of that pressure on them kind of solidified them and made them into a solid piece. Sediment which is where the word sedimentary comes from. Sediments are particles, so small pieces of soil or rocks that may be eroded and deposited. So they may break off. That's what eroded means. They may chip off and be deposited. So break off, carried away, and then dropped somewhere else. So weathering is when something breaks apart. Erosion is when those things are carried away, and deposition, or when something is deposited, is when it's dropped somewhere else. Our next vocabulary word is the words index fossil. So the remains of living things that were widespread but lived during a relatively short part of Earth's history are called index fossils. So they're organisms that were all over the place. They were all over the planet. There was a lot of them, but they only survived a very short period of time. And then we have the word fossil. A fossil is any evidence of an organism that lived in the past. So any kind of clue that we have left over to show that they lived in the past. Next, we're going to open up our textbook and read page 151 and answer the questions. What are sediments? How do sedimentary rocks form? What can relative age tell us about fossils? So let's go ahead and read through our science handbook and answer these three questions. So sedimentary rocks is going to be this page right here. Let's go back to our single page view. That way I can zoom in a lot more for you guys. There we go. Sedimentary rocks form from sediments that are cemented or pressed together. Sediments are tiny bits of soil and rock. Wind and water deposit most of the sediments. Over time, new sediments are deposited on top of older layers. So what does that mean? So sedimentary rocks are made of sediments. Those are tiny bits of rocks and soil and things that got dropped there over time. They were deposited into that area. Now, over time, they are kind of layered on top of each other and crushed together. And between the weight of the new layers and gravity, all of those over time create layers and layers and layers of these different sediments, and those become sedimentary rocks. Some sedimentary rocks contain minerals that were once dissolved in water. The minerals formed crystals among the sediments that came together to form the rock. Other sedimentary rocks are formed by the weight of the top layers pressing the sediments together. It can take millions of years for sediment to become rock. Conglomerates are sedimentary rocks with a coarse texture. That means rough texture. The grains of sediment are very large in this kind of rock. So here you can see a bunch of rocks squished together, but they're made up of larger chunks or other large rocks. The layers in sedimentary rocks are stacked in order of their relative age. Relative age is the age of one thing compared with another thing. The older the relative age of a rock layer, the lower it's found. Relative age also applies to any fossils in the rock layers. Fossils, the traces or remains of living things, are preserved in sedimentary rocks. Okay, so let's stop and think about this for a minute. When we're talking about relative age, when you're talking about things that are in rock layers or in layers of the earth, the deeper you go, the older those things are going to be. That means they got buried a long time ago, and after many, many, many years, things piled on top of them. So relative age means it's related to the things that are around it. So something that is lower is older than the thing that's going to be above it. That's what we're relating it to. We are relating it to other things that are also buried in the same area. So the lower rock layers and the lower fossils, the ones that are buried deeper in the ground, are older than the ones that are closer to the surface. Sandstone is a sedimentary rock that forms from layers of sand. Fossils are common in limestone rock formations. Okay, so that takes us to the end of our reading here. So what are sediments? That's going to be in our vocabulary and in our reading. How do sedimentary rocks form? Again, that's going to be up in these first two paragraphs of our reading. And what can relative age tell us about fossils? That's what we were just talking about. And that's going to be in our third layer. Please make sure you add lots of details and say it in your own words. When you go in to write your answer, remember to start with a capital letter and with punctuation. Check your spelling and grammar as you go through. Next, we're going to watch a video called Fossil Dig on how paleontologists find and recover fossils. Then we're going to answer the questions after we finished watching. So let's read our questions in advance before we get started. That way we know what questions we're going to be looking for, or what answers we're going to be looking for. Number 4 says, where can fossils be found in the United States? Number 5, what special tools are used to recover fossils? Number 6, why are fossils put into containers or bags? And number 7, why do you think paleontologists are so careful with fossils? So let's go ahead and pull up our video.
We can learn about dinosaurs from books, television shows, and movies. But we would not know anything about these ancient creatures if it were not for the scientists who study prehistoric life. These scientists are called paleontologists. Paleontologists search for and study fossils. Fossils are the remains of plants and animals that lived on Earth millions of years ago. So where do paleontologists search for fossils? Everywhere. There are fossil sites in almost every state in the U.S. Fossils can be found in the desert, in the plains, in the mountains, and in the Arctic, even in your own backyard. But some of the most popular places to dig for fossils are in the western part of the United States, like Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. Once paleontologists identify a site to search for fossils, they bring along special tools to dig for and remove these fossils. To break into big rocks, paleontologists use shovels or rock hammers to split the heavy layers. Once they get inside the rock, they take a more delicate approach with a tool called a chisel. A chisel is used to gently work the fossil away from the rock. Sometimes paleontologists need to use a small brush to clear debris and dirt away from the fossil for a better view. Once a fossil is successfully excavated, a fancy paleontology word for removed, it is put in a storage container or a specimen bag to protect it from being damaged. Does digging for fossils sound like fun to you?
Okay, that takes us to the end of the video. You can go ahead and rewind the video as many times as you like to find your answers. Where can fossils be found in the United States? That was in the very beginning of the video. What special tools are used to recover fossils? Why are fossils put into bags and containers? And why do you think paleontologists are so careful with fossils? All of these answers were found in the video. Please feel free to pause and rewind as much as you need. Next, we're going to go into pages 214 to 217 in our textbook in order to answer the questions, which parts of an organism are more likely to leave fossils? Number 9, list the types of fossils. Number 10, explain how scientists can know if dry land was once covered by an ocean. Number 11, what is an index fossil? Number 12, how do scientists know that trilobites are older than ammonites? Number 13, what is extinction? And number 14, how was the fossil of Smilodon used? So let's go ahead and jump back into our textbook. We're going to go to page 214. All right. Earth's history. Earth dates back over 4 billion years ago. About 3.5 billion years ago, the first unicellular organisms appeared. Over millions of years, other organisms developed. We know about these organisms through traces they left in rocks. So what does this mean? So roughly, paleontologists have dated the Earth back to about 4 billion years old. At about the 3.5 billion year mark, the first unicellular organisms, that means single cell organisms, we found evidence of those, or people have found evidence of those. So the reason we know about organisms is because they left things behind. They left traces behind in rocks. We call these traces fossils. Scientists use fossils to learn about the past. When some ancient organism dies, Their remains were covered with soil, sand, or some other sediment. Over many centuries, these sediments hardened around the organism's remains. Fossils are remains or traces of ancient organisms preserved in soil or rock. Almost all fossils are found in sedimentary rock. When a plant or animal dies, the soft parts quickly decay or are eaten. That's why hard parts of an organism generally leave fossils. So these are some of the questions we had been asked in our workbook. These parts include bones, shells, teeth, seeds, and woody stems. It's rare for soft parts of organisms to become a fossil. Types of fossils. So again, this is another one of your questions. Preserved remains. Sometimes entire organisms are preserved as fossils. Large elephant-like animals called mammoths have been found frozen in tundra ice. Insects and spiders can become trapped in sticky tree sap. The sap can harden into amber. Amber is a hard, smooth, translucent material that preserves these animals. The remains of these organisms can be seen through the amber. So it becomes kind of like a yellowish or golden colored kind of glass almost. And it's somewhat see-through. That's what translucent means. It's not completely see-through, but it's mostly see-through, where that will preserve the entire organism that gets stuck in it. So since it's kind of encased in this tree sap that becomes amber, other creatures are not eating it. Next, we have petrified fossils. When minerals replace all or part of an organism, a petrified fossil forms. Dinosaur bones are this type of fossil. Wood can also become petrified. Water-carrying mineral seeps into spaces in the organism's cells. Over time, the water evaporates, leaving the minerals behind. So what's happening with petrified fossils, because bones are somewhat hollow on the inside, water and minerals kind of get into the cracks and they fill it up. And then as that water evaporates, the minerals harden and those are left behind and they take the shape of whatever fossil was there. Carbon films. Leaves and insects are sometimes preserved as carbon films. When sediment buries an organism, some materials escape, leaving carbon behind. Over time, only a thin film of carbon remains. So this is an example of a carbon film fossil over here on the right side of the leaf. Next, we have trace fossils. Sometimes living things leave traces of their activity. An imprint is a mark made by an object pressing into materials such as mud. An imprint can become a fossil if it is not weathered away. Trails and burrows can also become trace fossils. So if we have an imprint, think of that like a footprint, right? It leaves a mark in whatever it is that it was on. Molds and casts. The most common fossils are molds and casts. Shells often leave behind fossils known as molds and casts. A mold is a hollow area in sediment in the shape of an organism or part of an organism. A mold forms when an organism buried in sediment breaks down, leaving an empty space. Later, water may deposit minerals and sediment into a mold, forming a cast. A cast is a solid copy of the shape of an organism. The word petrified means turned into stone. So over here, when we're talking about molds and casts, so think about having like Play-Doh. Now, if you press like a seashell into the Play-Doh and you take the seashell off, there's an imprint of the seashell. Now, if you pour something into that, so some kind of like cement, for example, if you pour cement into that mold that you made of the seashell, it's going to harden, right? And when you pull it out, you take that mold out after it's hardened, you take the cement piece out after it hardens, it's going to create kind of like a copy of that seashell, and we call that a cast. All right, let's take a look at our workbook so far. So 214 and 215 is what we read. Which parts of an organism are more likely to leave fossils, the types of fossils. So we can answer questions 8 and 9 so far, and then we're going to continue reading to be able to answer the rest. Fossils. What fossils tell us? Fossils give scientists information about environments of the past. Tropical forests once grew in what is now grasslands in Arizona. The tall fern plants once covered what is now icy Antarctica. Much of the United States was once covered by a shallow ocean. When scientists study a fossil site, they investigate more than just fossils. They investigate what the environment was like long ago. Ammonites once lived in Earth's oceans. Ammonite fossils are found in rock that is now on dry land. Ammonite fossils indicate that the land was once covered in water. So by looking at the fossils that are found in a certain area, you can tell what the land was like a long time ago. And we know land does change over time. So if you find fossils of ocean animals on dry land, then you know at some point that area must have been covered with water. Since fossils are found in rock layers, scientists can determine the relative ages of the fossils based on the layer in which they're found. So remember, we talked about this. Your deeper fossils are going to be older than the ones that are closer to the surface. Some fossils also provide clues to a rock layer's relative age. Index fossils are remains of living things that were widespread but lived during a relatively short part of Earth's history. For example, trilobites were sea animals that lived on Earth for millions of years. They suddenly died out or became extinct all over Earth at about the same time. The presence of fossil trilobites of the same kind of various rock layers indicates that those layers all formed at about the same time. The fact is true even if the layers are in different areas. Ammonites lived in water. These fossil ammonites were found on land. So you can take a look at these down here. These are really awesome fossils that are really well preserved. How deep an organism is buried gives clues about when the organism lived. Fossils found in sediment layers closest to the surface are usually the youngest. So the ones that are closer to the top are the newest ones. They formed recently. Fossils found in deeper layers are usually older. Ammonites are usually found in relatively deep rock layers. Trilobites are other organisms found in older, deeper rock. These organisms looked much like horseshoe crabs, an animal species that is still alive today. Unlike horseshoe crabs, trilobites have died out and become extinct. Extinction is the disappearance of a species when the last of its kind dies. Trilobites became extinct about 250 million years ago. Scientists have evidence that the horseshoe crab is the closest living relative of the trilobite. Fossilized bone can be used to compare extinct species with modern animals. In the 1880s, the fossilized bones of an organism named Smilodon were discovered. Smilodon is a type of large cat, often called a saber-toothed cat because it has large fangs that resemble the blades of a saber or sword. The fossilized fangs are larger than the fangs of modern big cats. Scientists generally agree that, like modern cats, Smilodon used its fangs for hunting. So here's a tiger, and this is going to be, we're comparing the teeth of the tiger to these teeth or fangs of the Smilodon skull. All right, let's take a look at our workbook. Explain how scientists can know if dry land was once covered by ocean. Again, you can go back over here onto page 216 to find that information. And then what is an index fossil? How do scientists know that trilobites are older than ammonites? What is extinction? And how is a fossil of Smilodon used? All of that information can be found between the bottom of 216 and page 217. Remember to use complete sentences when you're answering your questions. Okay, now we are going to move ahead and jump into our next pages. And we're going to read our handout called Exposing Rock Layers on How Earthquakes Can Change Earth's Surface. Then we're going to answer the questions after we finish the reading. So our questions here are, how can earthquakes expose fossils in rock layers? How can other types of weathering expose fossils in rock layers? How can a paleontologist determine the age of a fossil or rock layer that has been exposed by weathering or erosion? How do events such as the separation of the East African Rift Valley help scientists? So these are our 4 questions that we're going to focus on. Let's go ahead and take a look at our handout. So as you're finding the answers in your handout, go ahead and underline them so that once you go back to answer your questions in your workbook, you can find those right away. Annotate on your handout the same way we annotate with our math work. So underline all of the important things that you come across. How can an earthquake change Earth's surface? Earthquakes occur when seismic waves travel through Earth's surface, producing shaking that can be destructive and deadly. Seismic waves are generated when rocks break along faults or deep cracks in Earth's crust. The point where the break occurs along the fault is called the epicenter. Seismic waves travel outward from the epicenter. The epicenter can be near the surface or deep within rocks. Most earthquakes occur along or near tectonic plate boundaries. Faults can be horizontal or vertical. Vertical faults change the landscape significantly. Land along a vertical earthquake moves up and down. Large sections of rocks can be heaved upwards or thrust downwards. Earthquakes often expose rocks buried deep within Earth at the surface. These processes change features on Earth's surface. As rocks are exposed to new elevations, wind and water weather the rocks, breaking them down into smaller pieces. Revealing Earth's secrets. Scientists use the rocks exposed along areas of land that have been thrust upwards during an earthquake to understand the history of Earth. They use these once hidden rocks and any fossils contained within the rocks to develop a more complete history of Earth. A part of East Africa, called the East African Rift Valley, began moving apart 22 million years ago. During this process, large sections of rock were heaved upwards and exposed at Earth's surface. The rocks along the East African Rift Valley contain many valuable fossils. Scientists use these fossils to understand the tectonic history of the region, the organisms that lived in the region, and how the environment of this region changed through time. Work continues in the area to this day as scientists examine the rock layers, hoping to find more fossils to improve our understanding of how environments, climate, and organisms have changed over time. So let's review this reading. So an earthquake happens when we have seismic waves. Seismic waves are basically the vibrations, and earthquakes happen usually along faults close to the tectonic plates. Now, the place where an earthquake starts is called the epicenter. And a good way to kind of imagine this is think about when you drop a pebble into some water and you can see the waves moving outwards from that center point. The spot where you drop that rock, that is the epicenter of those waves that you created. Just like an earthquake's epicenter is the spot where the movement happened, and then those waves, those vibrations move out from that point. So we have different kinds of faults. We have vertical faults or horizontal faults. And vertical faults go up and down, horizontal goes side to side. So vertical faults happen, and when we have an earthquake along a vertical fault, that causes a lot of significant changes in Earth's surface because it's pushing things up or having things drop down. It's not just moving side to side. Now, along a particular area called the East African Rift Valley, this is an area where the rock layers started to move apart about 22 million years ago, and it's exposed a lot of important fossils that have helped people and paleontologists get a better understanding of Earth's history. So let's go ahead and take a look. How can earthquakes expose fossils and rock layers? We talked about that. How can other types of weathering expose fossils and rock layers? So think about when something is pushed up during an earthquake. Now that it's pushed up, it's exposed to water, it's exposed to wind. How can those further expose the fossils that are in those rock layers? How can paleontologists determine the age of a fossil or rock layer that has been exposed by weathering or erosion? And how do events such as the separation of the East African Rift Valley help scientists? So we've gone over all of this in our reading. Please feel free to go back to review your reading and then answer using complete sentences. Remember, these areas, especially the ones that have a lot of lines, give you space to put in a lot of detail in your answer. All right, once we've completed that, we have our performance task called fossil types. So you've learned that paleontologists use clues from fossils and rock layers to learn about past environments. Like a paleontologist, you will now research different types of fossils. You'll use multiple sources, including your textbook, to research 4 different types of fossils: mold fossils, trace fossils, cast fossils, and true form fossils. Based on your research, you'll draw one example of each and explain how your drawing illustrates that type of fossil. So what question will your research help to answer? It'll help to answer and clarify the different kinds of fossils, how they're alike and how they're different. You're going to draw your different kinds of fossils in here after you've researched them. Or sorry, you're going to write your notes over here about the different kinds of fossils after you research them. Then on the next page, you're going to draw an example of each of your kinds of fossils. And then using the information you collected, construct an explanation of how fossils help scientists understand what the surface of Earth used to look like. Use the specific types of fossils you researched in your explanation. And then after that, we're going to answer our essential question. Think about the photo of the fossil you saw at the beginning of the lesson. What do you know now about what fossils can tell us about Earth's history? Please use complete sentences when you're writing out your answer. You don't have to complete the I did statement. Once you've finished everything, please go back, review the lesson to prepare for your quiz and for your module test. If you have any questions, 4th grade, let me know. Otherwise, have an amazing day. Take care. Bye-bye.